Good Monday morning, everyone, and welcome. This is the third webinar hosted by the New York Fed as part of our ongoing culture initiative, and the first of this year. So we started this series in lieu of our annual spring conference, and while it's always great to meet in person, this format has actually proven to be really successful. We've been able to bring together people from all over to share the best practices and the diverse perspectives, and the conversations we've had so far have been very engaging and enlightening. I know this morning's panel will be exactly that, and I'm really looking forward to the next hour. Now, the goal of today's discussion is to consider how diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DE&I, is an inextricable part of culture. We also know that DE&I is a driver toward better decision-making and organizational outcomes. Consider this. What happens when decisions are made exclusively in places and among groups that don't offer diverse perspectives? And on the flip side, how much better are the results when those conversations include a wide range of voices and views? These conclusions are not purely anecdotal. Research shows that there's a correlation between companies with a more diverse leadership team and always a diversity exists in business performance. And for those companies without leadership diversity, not only do they fall below their counterparts with leadership diversity, but they are lagging. As a public service institution, it's vital that the Fed reflect the communities that we represent. Against the backdrop of extraordinary challenges, the global pandemic, the recession, and a reckoning for racial justice, the New York Fed has redoubled our efforts to build a more diverse, equitable, and inclusive culture at the New York Fed and in the Second District more broadly. Last year, we unveiled a new mission, vision, and values statements, and our commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion was woven throughout. We also launched a new people strategy, which placed creating a culture of inclusion at the heart of our priorities. As we look ahead, we will cement the progress we've made and further embed inclusive practices in our culture. So before I turn it over to Teresa to get things started this morning, I'd like to repeat the offer I made at the last two sessions, which is that we'd love to hear from you. Feel free to reach out to the committee to share your own perspectives and experiences so we can keep these conversations going. And please be on the lookout for the next webinar on the horizon and more projects related to these topics to come. So with that, over to you, Teresa, and thank you all for participating.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Teresa Torres, she, her, hers, Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. I'm honored to be moderating today's panel and look forward to a robust discussion on diversity, equity, and inclusion and culture. So joining me today are Erica Irish Brown, Chief Diversity Officer at Goldman Sachs. Erica brings extensive experience in diversity, equity, and inclusion, especially within financial services, where she has held leadership roles at Bloomberg, where she was the global head of DE&I, Bank of America, where she led diversity hiring initiatives, and Lehman Brothers, where I first met her, where she started her career as an analyst, eventually spearheading diversity recruitment. Next, Lasana Harris is an associate professor, UCL, Department of Experimental Psychology. Prior to joining UCL, Dr. Harris held positions at NYU, Duke University, and Leiden University. Dr. Harris's research addresses questions such as, how do we see people as less than human and non-human objects as human beings? How do we modulate effective responses to people? How do we decide right from wrong? And then finally, Betsy Levy-Pollock, who is a professor in the Department of Psychology, Princeton School of Public and International Affairs at Princeton University. Betsy is also the Deputy Director at the Kahneman-Treisman Center for Behavioral Public Policy. Her expertise lies in understanding social norms and norm change, individual and social network-wide behavioral change, and the reduction of prejudice and conflict, including ethnic and political conflict, youth conflict in schools, and violence against women. Her research on these topics has been set in the United States, Central and West Africa, and Latin America. So I am thrilled to have our panelists with us, and so let's get started. So my first question is for you, Erica. How do you affect change and successfully increase DE&I? Where do you even start?
Hi, Teresa. Thank you for that introduction. And I just would like to thank you for having me today. It's always a privilege to be part of the dialogue and try to advance the thought leadership around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I'm never in a position where I can't still learn and grow, especially from the panelists that I get to work with. And so I'm really excited about today's dialogue. So thank you. You know, I wish I had all the answers, but certainly, where do you start? You need the commitment from the top, right? Whether or not that's your CEO, whether or not that's your board of directors, you need the commitment to do something different, right? That's what diversity means, difference. And if you expect to do the same things and achieve a different outcome, then, that's not really going to move the needle at all. You need to set the groundwork. Whatever that level of education and awareness is, there are a lot of organizations on this Zoom. Everybody's in a different place, right? So you have to meet organizations where they are, meet people where they are, meet regions where they are, and set the groundwork. So whether or not it's defining D&I, being clear on what it is and what it isn't, creating a common language, sharing the research, and even some base level training. So, there's a lot of content around how effective training like unconscious bias is or isn't. But for me, I would rather have everybody be trained in unconscious bias, create a certain awareness, a certain shared language, without the expectation that a 2-hour training course means that we've eradicated unconscious bias in the organization. But it certainly sets the stage. You've got to set the stage. And then the last thing I'd say is you have to identify what are the opportunities, what are our objectives, what are we trying to address here? And you have to take a data-driven approach from my perspective. Understanding the data, being transparent around the pain points, understanding the data around culture as well. It's diversity and inclusion. And I think that's also important that you're addressing both. Very often you hear people use the word diversity in isolation, and they don't address equity or inclusion. And without that, especially without that inclusion piece, diversity, you're not going to be successful in advancing diversity. So I do think in terms of understanding, taking an assessment, understanding the culture, the organization, what's going on, and what your goals and objectives are. And setting out those goals and objectives, it gives your colleagues and your organization a vision for what you're working towards. Whether or not that's specific goals and objectives like aspirational goals that may be set based on what the data is telling you, may be set at the entry-level hiring level, may be set at VP representation level. But you have to know what you're working towards, goals and objectives, and then move forward from there, and communicate the progress along the way. There's a lot of work that goes into this, and you need to have two-way communication to understand what that progress is, and to let people know we heard you and we did this. We set this objective and we're making this level of progress.
Thanks, Erica. As I was listening to you, it's when you talk about assessment and then, where you are and where you want to go, it's the what you want to do, but also how are you going to do that? And that how is so important in communicating and letting people within your organization and external to your organization know what you're doing to affect change. So thank you so much for that. And Lasana, I want to turn to you to ask the same question. When you think about DE&I, how do you affect change and successfully increase it? And where would you even start if you were talking to organizations or universities about this topic?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. And I just want to echo one of the many excellent points that Erica made, which, as I would put it, is sort of why are we doing this, right? Why are people showing up to listen to this seminar today? Why are people interested in DE&I? And I think the history of DE&I in organizations has really been about a checkbox exercise, a way of avoiding litigation, let's say. But if those are the goals that you have for engaging in DE&I work, I think those goals won't lead you to a place where it's actually effective. Now, there's tons of data suggesting that more diverse organizations are better off financially in terms of their profit margins. There are all of the social justice and ethics arguments we can make about why you care about D&I. But I think sort of identifying within your company your motives for engaging in DE&I work is a really crucial first step, because that identification is going to take you in a particular direction that's going to be bespoke to your company and organization and make the work you're doing around DE&I much more effective than it otherwise might be. So really having a grip on sort of why this is important, why are we investing the time and the resources, is really the crucial first step, in my opinion. Once we've done that, then, as Erica mentioned, all of these other points come into focus, right? There has to be a commitment from the top, right? So you can't have the lone DE&I officer doing their work without the backing of the institution behind them, or else the work is going to not be as effective. You have to set the groundwork, meet people where they are, figure out where you are as a company, and then take steps to make necessary changes, because there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach to DE&I, right? You just can't grab an unconscious biased tool out of a toolkit and try to hit every company with it. It just won't work. And in order to figure out where people are, again, Erica is preaching to my heart here with this point, but you have to look at the data, right? As a scientist, data is paramount in how we go about strategizing in terms of the theories that we develop. I think it's just as important for DE&I work as well, right? You have to know, where do you sit as a company in terms of your representation at all levels of your organization. You have to then use that data to help you shine a new light on what you do as an organization. So it really takes a comprehensive approach that starts with being really clear about the motives or the goals you have for engaging in this work, and then approaching it in such as a manner that you can instantiate changes that are consistent with those goals and motives.
Lasana, thank you for that. And, you know, as I'm listening to both you and Erica, it's very, very clear in regards to the goal setting is so important, but goal setting with having really a lot of meaning behind it, and not just a checkbox that, you know, DE&I is the thing to do, and so let's put a program in place. It's really, how are you going to utilize whatever you're doing to truly transform an organization and affect change? And Betsy, I would like to turn to you. Is there anything that you'd like to add to, you know, how you can affect change and successfully increase DE&I? What are your thoughts?
Sure. Hi. And first of all, I just want to echo what Erica said about what an honor it is to be here with you all and with these panelists too. I want to give you an answer based on research that we've been doing in my lab over the past number of years. And that's about this idea of culture change and widespread sort of patterned behavior change. And so one question that we've been asking is whether there are particular messengers, particular people in an organization that can influence a culture. And so the answer that we've been coming across in a bunch of different, field studies is that the people who can do this are the people whose behavior is most watched in an organization. So notice that I didn't say the people who are most visible, because there are people who are very visible by dint of their roles, their prominence within an organization, who might not be the culture makers, right? And so what I'm talking about here are people who are most watched, meaning that others in the organization are really choosing to watch these people. And because they are most watched, the behavior, the public behavior of these folks really comes to define what is acceptable, what is typical, what's desirable in that organization, or in essence, what is cultural. And so who are these people? I just want to give an example from a study that we did in middle schools, which I'm told is okay to use here. And I always have to reassure adults it is uncomfortably apt, a comparison to our adult organizations. So when we use social network analysis in, over 50 middle schools across the state of New Jersey, what we were finding is that the students' behavior who was most watched, we were going and looking for the students who were these culture makers at the school in order to try to reduce conflict there. And what we found is that there were some of these classic, what we would call popular people who were very watched. They were occupying, prominent roles in the school, like the captain of the football team, or other types of roles like student president and things like this. But there were also people within smaller cliques, within smaller sub areas of the schools, who were very respected and watched within those subgroups. And what we found over a randomized control trial over the course of a year of doing anti-conflict programming in these schools is that it was those people in particular that if you encouraged them to change their behavior in ways that they felt comfortable with and endorsed, they were the ones who really changed, spreading across the network, other students' perspectives of what was acceptable. Was it acceptable to use a joke about race or a joke about someone's size or, what they could afford to wear to school? But really importantly, it was also, they were the ones who were spreading different types of behavior according to records, administrative records from the school that we collected at the end of the year on peer conflicts. And so one reason why I want to raise this is that this is a very nuanced point, and I agree with what's been said about so many different things mattering. But at least from our research lab's perspective, what we want to do is set out a contrast in terms of, this is a different approach using this kind of cultural norms approach and targeting messengers, trying to get them to change what people think of as acceptable at the organization. It's a different approach than the one that many organizations, as been pointed out, typically reach for, which is this individual training, just get everybody into a session to try to change their personal knowledge or ideas or beliefs. And the reason that I draw that in contrast is because we're not seeing in our data that to be a very effective approach. One, it's very hard to change people's personal attitudes and opinions. We're finding that the effect sizes are very small if there's change at all. But number two, say you do change attitudes, even of a large proportion of the population. If they don't see that those norms are changing, that the desirability of these attitudes is changing among, the entire organization, they're likely to bite their tongues and remain silent in situations where that's called for. So, this is why we're taking this approach in my lab right now.
Thank you for that, Betsy. And Lisanna, I'd like to turn it over to you to just, comment on what Betsy was just sharing. As I was listening to you, Betsy, you were describing, when I think about corporate culture, inclusive leadership behaviors. So those inclusive behaviors, and you're exhibiting those, and, individuals are seeing that exhibited, and then that becomes a norm. Lisanna, definitely would want to hear your thoughts as well on what Betsy just shared.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of merit in that research sort of suggesting mechanisms or levers that you can pull that would lead to changes in approaches to D&I. And the social norms are certainly really relevant. I think in addition to that, however, you may run into a problem where once you've identified those highly visible people, they may be unwilling to engage in the work that's required to change DE&I at a company. And so that raises the question, well, how do you then convince such people that this is a worthy cause that they should be championing, that they should be modeling the right types of behaviors that would influence the norms and have a broader impact across the organization? And on that point, I think our research suggests that it is possible to convince people without even attempting to change their attitudes towards D&I. And so going back to the initial point I made about sort of your overall goals, why are we doing this? Everyone within an organization who holds a particular role, I assume, aspires to be the best person in that role that they can be. And so we all have a goal of being the best, in my case, professor or researcher that I can be. And so if I can get me as the example to focus on that goal, there's usually something above that that would benefit from changing the way that I approach D&I. So I'll give you a few examples from some research we've done. So with a bunch of marketeers at a large multinational corporation, we went in to try to change the content of their communications, basically. These marketeers were, despite initiatives suggesting that they should engage in more diverse representation, were struggling to do this. And so we went into them as creative professionals and we said, look, if you want to be a creative professional, what really matters is that you're novel and creative. If your work relies on cultural stereotypes, everybody is doing that. Your work by definition is going to be less novel and creative. And we discovered that that kind of approach increased the unstereotypicality, if you will, of the communication products that these marketeers then produce. So without messing with their attitudes about representation and DE&I, by simply refocusing their goals on the fact that you can be better at your job if you take this seriously, people were convinced that this is an effort that they should make. And I think a similar approach would work within almost any organization. Some colleagues of mine in the US have done this approach in an educational setting as well, looking at teachers and disciplinary problems with African American students, and found that getting them to focus on their role as a teacher and the value that empathy plays, for instance, in making connections to students, which is really why a lot of them get into that business, can be enhanced, right, if they sidestep their biases and focus on every student as an opportunity to fulfill that goal. Again, decrease the number of African American students that were sent to the principal office for disciplinary reasons. So by sort of refocusing people on their goals and building DE&I into the pursuit of those goals, which again is very possible given all of the research about the benefits of DE&I. I think it's possible to change these influences, as Betsy put it, such that they are now more likely to model behavior that would be rewarded by the company anyway because they're striving for excellence in their role, but also now promotes DE&I in a way that perhaps it may not have been promoted before.
Lasana, thank you for that. And as I was looking at some of the research you had done, you talk about coming at it in regards to, Teresa, if you want to be successful, if you have bias in your decision making, that's going to make you less successful. And so we're going to help you to understand that in order to be successful, you have to, remove these impediments from how you're thinking. So it's more about me being successful than it is about changing how I think about DE&I. Right, and focusing that on the success factors. So, Erica, from an organizational standpoint, we've heard from both Betsy and Lasana, having those social norms and having those individuals that people are looking to, whether it's the CEO or the head of a business line or just an influencer in the organization, and having them kind of set that tone, and then also coming at it from DE&I is only going to make you individually be more successful by incorporating that into how you're operating. How have you seen it in corporations? Have you seen both utilized? Are they interwoven? What's been your experience?
Yeah, I was going to say, Teresa, I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I think you need both. And I don't think you want it just to be about that individual's success, but their shared success. So I think when we think about business performance, when we think about higher performance of diverse teams, when we think about bottom line for the organization in sharing the research, I think all of those should be motivating factors. If you can't be an exceeds performer in your organization, if you haven't engaged in advanced D&I at the company, then again, there's shared reward there. So yes, the reward systems have to be in line with the behavior that you're trying to get your leaders to engage in. But there's accountability at every level. And, I do believe that you can educate people and give individuals the tools. I think a lot of times, my mother used to say, if you don't know better, you can't do better. So I do think that you can inform people, educate them, give them tools to be more inclusive leaders, to be more inclusive individuals, to understand cultural differences. So, I think you can't change people per se, but you can inform them. And I completely agree with the concept of influencers. And there are influencers on every level. The people that influence the organization the most are the executive leaders. So they have to sponsor D&I as a business imperative. They have to communicate their commitment, their focus on D&I. They have to set some level of accountability throughout the organization. And most importantly, they have to role model that behavior. It can't just be talking the talk. They've got to both talk and walk that walk and role model that behavior. And then at the functional leadership level and managers, they've got to take that to the next level and implement it in their organizations. For most people, especially in our large organizations, while the executive leadership team are setting the goals and objectives for the organization and trying to communicate and message broadly, that's not who your mid-level managers are experiencing day to day. So, to engage mid-level managers, those goals, objectives, the message, they have to be cascaded. They have to be enforced. And that's where inclusive leadership really comes into play. That hands-on, day-to-day, visible support, enablement, and inclusive leadership. And that is something that should be measured as part of a manager's performance. The last thing I'll say is, individuals are who most people experience in the workplace, most days, right? So I know we're in a virtual environment right now. I used to say it's the person to your left and your right. It's the person who does or doesn't invite you to coffee. It's the person who does or doesn't invite you to lunch or for a cocktail after work or share information. So there is accountability at the individual level, and engaging in D&I is not just something that should be an expectation for people who consider themselves diverse, right? That's the inclusion piece. Everybody should be included in how we engage around D&I, whether or not it's the employee resource groups or attending an activity or just challenging the status quo. We've got to apply a D&I lens to all of our behaviors and challenge ourselves to be more inclusive in our actions day in and day out.
Erica, thank you for that. And I just wanted to ask you, when you think back over all of this work that you've done for years, you mentioned something about, walking the talk, right? And we've heard that you've got to have people that walk the talk. Is there, and you don't have to name names, but does any, person come to mind or an example of someone that walked the talk that you could share with us, that this is when I saw this person doing this was walking the talk?
Yeah, I think, instead of talking about specific people, I'll talk about specific results. There are CEOs that have diverse leadership teams, and there are CEOs whose leadership teams do not reflect the diversity of the communities and constituents and clients that they serve, for example. So, the diversity of leadership teams, the inclusive leadership behaviors, which does require people to visibly support D&I initiatives, visibly support diverse leaders, empower their teams to make decisions, that type of behavior. People know when teams and leaders are empowered or not. A leader that seeks out diverse views, that's an inclusive leader who takes advice, implements feedback, has open communication in an environment that, people feel like they can have a healthy discourse without any repercussion. That's the type of role model behavior that I'm talking about.
Great, thank you for that. I wanted to go on to a different type of question, talking about structural factors. So Betsy, I wanted to start with you. When you think about structural factors that contribute to or detract from an inclusive culture, what would those be to you?
Yeah, thank you. I'm so glad that we're talking about structure specifically. And one reason is that it's come up for me a lot lately because we just completed a meta-analysis of the last dozen years of research on prejudice reduction, which is, a topic that's broader than DE&I in organizations. So it included really every kind of intervention that social scientists, biomedical scientists have been working on and doing research on to try to reduce prejudice and expressions of prejudice. And what we found is that over the last dozen years, when we coded all of these different interventions, 75% of them were what we would call light touch, brief, easy to implement, cheap, right? So the sort of like idea that we can kind of nudge away prejudice, you know, as we've been talking about in behavioral economics for a while. And unsurprisingly to probably many of you, what we also found is that the effect of, you know, the average intervention that does this is incredibly small. And the more you look at the more and more rigorous research within this sample, the smaller it gets, right? And so I take this as a mandate to be bold, to be ambitious, to think about structure, not about these small, light touch kinds of interventions. And, you know, what was just brought up about, you know, what leaders are doing, right, and representation at the leadership level. One sort of glib way that I've been explaining it to, you know, fellow academics is that, you know, for the past dozen years, it's like, you know, a lot of social scientists have been thinking like, well, let's see how this trickles up. Let's do a white fragility training and then see if there's more representation at the corporate board, you know, a couple of years later. Let's see if that works. But let's flip that on its head. Let's start with more representation. And then if you're interested in measuring things like white fragility, see whether that changes, you know, after you get, you know, this kind of more representation at the top. I'm you know, sort of gliding over a lot of complicated issues here, but, you know, that's the way I've been trying to communicate the mandate that, you know, we need to take bolder steps to intervene into organizations. And I'll just say one last thing about this, which is that also when I'm explaining issues of culture, one of my favorite toy examples is to get people to think about the kind of culture in an academic department for seminars. So a lot of you may have read this article recently in the New York Times about the culture of economics seminars, which involves a lot of harsh interrupting and questioning of speakers. And what a recent study found is that this is particularly aimed at women and people of color in these seminars. In my own personal home department, psychology, the culture is different than that. Usually we're very quiet while the speaker speaks and then save our questions for the end. But you find that this changes from university to university. And so I always use that example to say, well, it's not the case that that's what we hire on, right? So as you move from university to university and see that this culture changes, it's not because that university just interviewed them and said, well, how will you behave in a seminar? It's that people come in, they see these very public examples of how you should treat someone. And that's what happens in those seminars. And so we have opportunities to change behavior in these very public demonstrations of how we treat one another. And so back to this idea of structure, it's not just representation in jobs, it's also social structures. So these very public ways of modeling behaviors, that's another way to think about changing structure. And I mean, my final, you know, mention of this little favorite toy example of mine is that it even changed within my own department, I have to say, to tell a story about this. So even though in psychology we are very polite, you know, we let people talk, we usually praise them after, you know, the discussion. Thank you for that. And if I may, you know, offer a question. But one piece that I think is very important that I noticed as a big inequality in my own department was that graduate students were often very left out of the Q&A session. And one thing that I noticed happening was that our department moved buildings. And we went from having a seminar in one building where faculty sat on these easy chairs on the inner circle and graduate students sort of gathered around outside of that circle. We moved to a new room where there was just a round table and everyone had to sit at it. And it was kind of interesting. It wasn't explicit policy. It was an architectural accident that suddenly graduate students were asking questions at the same time and at the same rate as faculty. And, you know, this isn't one of my, you know, large-scale studies, but I have to say that I think it changed the way, in my observation, the way faculty were seeing graduate students in our department, because it was this very collective public experience of how everyone was engaging and how people were including one another. So I would just encourage people to think about structure both as the big stuff, who is being hired, what are the rules of the organization, but also the social structures. So how are you observing one another interact? Where are these public spaces where you could intervene to set a different norm that I think has ripple effects throughout the rest of the organization, even when people are in private.
Thank you, Betsy. That's an incredible example. I mean, they literally were at the table finally, instead of being on the outskirts of the table. So that's a great example. Lasana, same question. Same question for you around structure. What contributes to or detracts from?
Yeah, I think that's a fascinating question, and I really appreciate Betsy's example. I mean, I was one of those graduate students in that department many years ago, so I can identify. I think the other thing we have to take into account are the sort of classic levers of behavior, right? The carrot and the stick. And I think it's interesting that the Fed is sort of hosting this discussion, right? Because you guys usually come with the stick. And so your approach to culture change is usually through regulation and setting the rules and penalties if people fail to abide. I think thinking about incentives for great DE&I behavior is also another positive approach. So in academia, what I've noticed over the last few years is that people now, when you have to apply for an academic job, in addition to talking about your research and your teaching, they're asking for diversity statements. So they're asking for you to document how have you aided diversity in your own research. And that's really important, right? Because now anyone who wants an academic job has to at least consider diversity as part of their application package. Similarly, in the awards we give out for people at different stages of their careers, are also beginning to ask for diversity statements, right? So that you're not just getting an award because you've done fantastic work, right? You're getting an award because the work that you've done is moving our community along in this issue of DE&I. And so I think if you tie DE&I with two incentive structures, it's going to, one, not leave the burden of DE&I work for diverse people, right? So other people will be motivated to engage in this work because there are clear career benefits to them for engaging in this work. And then think about the company more globally. If we hit different DE&I targets, is it possible then that we will see benefits that result from that? I think companies have taken this approach to some extent regarding environmentalism and climate change, where they're rewarding behaviors, for instance, that encourage people to recycle and to travel less and all of these good things. So you have to bake it into the reward systems that are there that you can use, and that will motivate people to engage with DE&I work. And then the regulation piece is key as well. Like I said, it's really excellent that the Fed is sort of having this conversation, because you also need to create penalties for people who fall short. If we're really truly serious about changing DE&I work, we have to treat it in some cases like an ethical issue, right? As in, people may violate the rules of ethics to get an unfair advantage in business, right? And similarly, we need to think about DE&I in similar terms, right? If you're falling short in DE&I, you're doing a public disservice, right? You're doing something that's harming the community. You're doing something that's not making full use of the potential that we have within our companies. So at every level, I think you could bake it into the incentives and rewards, as well as the penalties. And I think that might also push structural change forward on this issue.
Thank you, Lasana. And want to turn over to you, Erica, because I know we want to go to question and answer session from the audience, but I'm going to ask you the same question. What structural factors contribute to or detract from an inclusive culture?
It's always hard to come behind Betsy and Lasana. You know, they've said a lot that rings true, I think, whether or not you're talking about academic institutions or financial services organizations. You know, you've got to build it into the systems and the structures. So I agree wholeheartedly. While I lead a broad D&I function, my goal is to embed all things D&I and to place a diversity and inclusion lens on all of our practices and processes and embed it as business as usual, right? So D&I is not just the job of my team or not just the job of the HR team, but it's just built into how we do business, how leaders lead, how hiring managers hire, how people are compensated. So, you know, I will share just, you know, very practically, when you think about the employee life cycle, right? From hiring, there should be a policy in place and a practice that you're evaluating diverse slates and that you're measuring that you're requiring it, that you're holding people accountable to that, and that you do in fact have a diverse slate policy. In performance evaluation, we touched on this in a couple of places, but if inclusive leadership is not a competency that you're being held accountable to, if that's not something that there's some consequence, if you're not inclusive, if you're not building a diverse team, if there's no consequence, then there will be no action, because it does take extra effort, it does take extra work, and it has to just be built into how we're evaluated as leaders. And even when you think about evaluation systems, are they objective or subjective? How are you building in, probably both, but making sure that there's an opportunity to be objective, and how are you making sure that is being applied equally and equitably across all of your people? And what is the role of, who's really being held accountable? Very often when we talk about diversity and inclusion initiatives, we're really focused on that individual that's considered diverse and their performance and what they're not doing or what skills we need to give them. But again, what skills do we need to give the managers? How are we holding them accountable to develop their people across dimensions of difference, and not just in terms of race and gender, but even as our organizations are global, leading cross-culturally, leading globally, and building up those competencies for themselves. The last thing I'll say, since it is something that we've done at Goldman Sachs, we've also tried to put policies in place that systemically can help change not just the people that work for Goldman Sachs, but the people we do business with. So we put a policy that we won't take companies public that don't have at least one diverse board member. That was effective last year in July. It will become 2 this year. So that is something that we've done that we think can influence the broader ecosystem. A lot of the clients that we pitch business to now are asking diversity and inclusion questions, are asking us to disclose our demographics as a firm, and it's part of the process in order to get business. So when, capital allocators are making policies that say this is important to us, the people who want to be allocated capital respond. So there are lots of ways to handle it structurally, both from inside an organization as well as outside. And I think that we need to pull every lever we can if we're truly going to move the needle on diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Thank you, Erica. And I think that goes to, have what Betsy said earlier. There's got to be some bold moves, right, put in place. And I think, Lasana also captured it perfectly, saying that there's benefits. So if you're doing this right, you may potentially get more business from your organization. But if you're not doing it, you may potentially not get the business, right? So there's that, reward, and also, there can be some consequences to not doing this effectively. So thank you for sharing those examples. I do want to share a question from the audience, and this is for all of our panelists, so whoever would like to jump in first. What data should you or could you collect to influence DE&I efforts?
I'll jump in. I think when you look at your data, you want to look at overall. First of all, you have to look at what data you're collecting, because every company is different and every country has different rules on what you can collect. In a perfect world, you're collecting across all dimensions: race, gender, ethnicity, people with disabilities, veteran status, sexual orientation, gender identity, I should have said earlier. So there's a lot of data that you can collect, and you want to have strong data collection. And so self-ID is something that a lot of D&I leaders are working on, global self-ID campaigns to collect comprehensive data around the world so that you can level set on who your population is. And then looking at data, whether or not it's by those different dimensions, looking at what their employee satisfaction survey results are, and or looking at promotion rates, looking at attrition rates, looking at external hiring rates. You really have to look at all of the data, and not just in isolation, but on a relative basis. There's the quantitative nature, then there's the analytics behind it. And you really have to be thoughtful around the analytics to say, okay, what are these numbers actually telling me? Right. And that's really where you can get into developing solutions and identifying opportunities for change.
If I can jump in as well, I think Erica is exactly right. And I would add to this that it's hard work. So I also think you want to look at qualitative data. You want to sit and have a conversation with your clients, your customers, with your employees to figure out where they sit as well. I mean, particularly if you have no idea where to start. So when we started doing DE&I work at our university, and we really started from zero. We started by sort of just talking to people, right? Talking to the students, what are their experiences like? Talking to the employees, what are their experiences like? What are the things that they thought we could be doing better? What things are we doing well enough? It's just sort of getting every bit of information you can. So it's a lot easier to go out and get the quantitative data. It's easy to do a survey, relatively easy. It's easy to look at data that's already been collected and available. But I also think, I mean, this is a human issue as well. You have to go talk to the human being. You have to get their point of view and perspective. And those conversations will turn up things that didn't make it onto the survey, right? They will turn up indicators, or they will suggest indicators that you can look at that you might already have the data for, but you didn't consider as relevant or necessary or important. So I think in addition, you have to do the hard qualitative work as well.
Thank you for that, Lasana. Betsy, any comments on the metrics piece?
Yeah, I'll very quick, because I really love both of these suggestions. I'll just speak as someone who has tried in collaboration with companies to evaluate their DE&I efforts. And it's kind of interesting as an organization to think from that perspective. So how would we know we're doing well, right? And one source of data that we've looked for is qualitative, but it's already happening. It's just not often being recorded, which is how people are being reviewed for promotion. So it's very interesting to see what kind of language is being used when someone is being evaluated either for promotion or just annually. And then, as you ask yourself, what would convince a skeptic that we're doing well? Obviously, you would want to look at, who's being promoted, who's being retained, who's being hired, of course, but also think about kind of interim steps, those kinds of smaller cultural changes that you hope that you're going to see. And one thing that's been interesting about that process of trying to collect those data is that sometimes companies have realized, well, we don't really have anything that's interim that we could collect data on. And so this isn't from my personal research, but I know another research team actually worked with a global corporation to create smaller programs, such as take a colleague out for coffee, a mentoring coffee kind of thing, because they just wanted that for the research to see whether the diversity training was going to have any effect. But isn't that kind of a great program to have anyway? And that's a good thing to collect data on. So that's another way to think about the metrics, is just how would we convince ourselves that we're changing anything? And so think about interim steps as well as long-term, objectives that are not too long-term, but, the big stuff that we already collect.
Thank you, Betsy. And the qualitative and the quantitative are so important, because I think, when I usually get asked this question around metrics, everyone goes straight to the demographics, right? How many do you have of this? How many do you have of that? What levels are they at? And to Lasana's point, that's a data point, but are you also getting the voice of the individuals that you're, looking to support and advance and help? Are you getting their voice into the solution? Before you even go out and start to say, this is what we have to do, are you getting those voices in? So I appreciate all of the responses. Thank you very much for that. And we do have time for one last question. So I'm going to take a question from Noel Boyland. So the question is, regarding backlash, what are the obvious company actions that contribute to it, and what are key methods to minimize the scope of backlash before it emerges, while still obviously advancing the DE&I goals?
I can jump in and start. I think backlash is definitely out there. And I think one of the things I said earlier was the communication piece, establishing what diversity and inclusion is and what it isn't. I think very often there's backlash because there's a lack of understanding of what it is and what it isn't. And if you are approaching it truly as diversity, equity, and inclusion, there should not be conflict in terms of what the objectives are, that it's still meant to be a meritocracy, that everyone is included, including your straight, white, non-disabled male, that this is about the organization. This is about expanding the net. It's about, it's not about cutting people out. So I do think how you communicate, how you bring people in, how you make it clear that everybody has a role, and that it is not upsetting the meritocracy, which very often is that main concern, and really explaining the difference between diversity and inclusion and how to level that playing field. That's what I would share as a first step to abating backlash in the organization.
Thank you for that, Erica. Lasana, Betsy, any thoughts on this?
I'm worried that we're worried too much about backlash. I don't know of great research on this that shows. I don't necessarily want to speak for everyone, of course, but I don't know a lot of research that shows some of the substantive impact of backlash. There's a lot of talk about this. This is a huge narrative in our society today. So I would say I just want to reinforce and echo what Erica is saying about the importance of strong, steady communication, about how important this is, about not backing down from the importance of DEI, but also, a really clear articulation of why this is important to our community, what it means. But I don't have a great answer except to just question the question maybe a little bit. I worry that our worries about this are getting in the way of some of this bolder action that we're calling for.
Agreed.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting and thought-provoking question. And I guess my response is that backlash highlights a structural problem within your organization. I think within every organization, nobody agrees all of the time. And there are going to be people who disagree with any policy decision within an organization. But if that disagreement is now affecting the effectiveness of the organization, that's a structural problem. And so to me, backlash falls into that category where there is space for disagreement within your organization and you have structures in place where people can feel like they've been heard, where your communication is clear. But if the backlash isn't just noise, if it's really having a negative impact on your organization, that highlights a structural flaw that you need to address within the organization. And for that reason, again, I think the DE&I work that you're doing is for the benefit of the organization as well, right? Because it's going to reveal flaws within your system that are things you might want to change anyway, because it's just going to make for a better system, a better democracy, let's say, right? A better meritocracy, a better company. And so I would say backlash is important to pay attention to from the perspective of helping you identify places where you need to make changes. And those are usually changes around your communication, changes around voice, right? How do people feel like their voice have been heard? Changes around ideas about representation. And so I think backlash is an opportunity to sort of re-examine your company, have a quick forensic or a longer forensic analysis, and identify the structural flaw that's causing the backlash to have a negative impact.
I really appreciated what you just said, Lasana, that you could look at this as an opportunity to see what's underneath that and how can you change that to help, really remove any bottlenecks to change. So thank you for that. And unfortunately, I'm sure we could have this conversation for another 2 hours, but we're reaching the top of the hour, and I do want to turn it back over to President Williams to close us out. But before I do that, wanted to thank Betsy, Lasana, and Erica so much for being our subject matter experts and sharing the experiences you've had and the work that you've been putting into diversity, equity, and inclusion. We all appreciate it. And on behalf of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York and all of our participants, thank you so much. So now I'll turn it back over to President Williams.
Thank you, Teresa, and I want to add my thanks to Betsy, Erica, and Lasana. It's been a terrific, amazing conversation, and I've been taking notes and thinking about all the topics that we covered in actually only about 55 minutes is remarkable. I think, a couple of themes that I heard out of this morning that I think came out of a lot of the discussion. One is this notion of having a very strong communication and shared language around DE&I and really getting to the question of what are we trying to achieve, what are our objectives, why are we doing this? And one thing I know from leadership is you can't have this is the 2020 objectives and this is the 2021, but really thinking about this as an ongoing objectives and ongoing efforts, and with this understanding of why we're doing it and what good looks like. The second thing, which I think was very interesting, and I definitely experienced this in my own life, is the unique, the importance of the tone of the top, the support of the senior leadership, but also this notion of what I heard you call culture makers or culture carriers and the most watched. And this notion that in an organization, we have about 3,100 employees, but you can think of any size organization, the tone at the top is essential. I mean, that's you have to have that. But that you have to really think about what are the other leaders, whether formal or informal, how are they representing themselves or represent themselves, or how are they carrying these messages forward? I just think that's a really important insight for all of us. And the third, which is the one I think is absolutely the most important, is this idea of bold action, that trying small, working on the margins, working on the in that way is not going to get us where we need to be, and we need to really be thinking creatively. I think also experimenting, but really being willing to take bold and decisive actions and hold people accountable and hold ourselves accountable as leaders in any organization. So you brought a lot of research, a lot of practice, a lot of deep thought into these discussions. It's been a terrific session. We've now had 3 of these virtual sessions on culture. I think they've really brought together how culture connects in many different ways, whether we think about ethical culture, trust, and we think about DE&I, and we're going to continue this conversation. I know we're in the early stages planning our 4th webinar, and so please, everybody, stay tuned for that. We're going to we'll continue to convene and bring together thought leaders as we continue this journey on culture in the banking sector, financial services more generally. So again, thank you to the panelists today, and thank you, Teresa and the team, for an outstanding job of putting this together, and look forward to our next webinar as well. Everyone, stay safe.